Corey, for those who didn't know you not that well, can you like introduce yourself for the audience?
Yeah. So Corey Chapman, I am American. So I was born or actually raised in Indianapolis, Indiana. Grew up playing a lot of different sports and ended up really focusing on track and field and football in high school. And that's when I ended up playing football in college and then found my way over here to Stuttgart, Germany, where I played professionally for 10 years. 10 years? Yeah. So my final season was in 2021. But in that time, so me being full time here in Germany, that allowed me to also really get things going with the performance development side. So I had an opportunity to work independently with a lot of athletes, so a lot of Bundesliga players. Eventually, I was then employed by VfB Stuttgart, so the Bundesliga team here in Stuttgart, where I worked in the academy for 2 years. Um, Eventually, I made my way over to the rehab side, which was a nice change, and I also got a chance to learn a lot there as well. And now I'm back to being self-employed, but working with through for Speedworks as a performance consultant. So I still get a chance to work hands-on with athletes, but I also get to work with coaches as well. So we do a lot of coaches education, helping them kind of develop their understanding for the fundamentals of speed development and their coach's eyes. So yeah, I'm really happy to, of course, to be a part of the Speedworks family. So there's a lot of brilliant minds there, and I'm just really happy to be in the position that I'm in right now. So I really feel like I'm doing what I was put on this earth to do. So uh, for that, I'm extremely happy and grateful.
Nice. So, what's the difference between training speed yourself or like training track yourself and now like training athlete their speed?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. So you mean back then when I was a high school athlete?
Yeah.
I think probably one of the biggest differences is just the research that was, I graduated high school in 2006. So, and then eventually I graduated college in 2011. So even then, like playing football, and that was a Division I college, so, a lot of things we did back there would probably have probably been refuted through research. Um, so I mean, that's one of the great things about our job is it's not finite, right? So it's not like math where 2 plus 2 will always be 4. Something that we do today might change and be completely different next year. And that's also what I love so much about doing what I do is I get a chance, I'm continually developing. So I think I'll never be in a position where I've learned everything I could because it changes so often. Right. But I would say to come back to your question, I think the biggest difference is just the research, but then also the mindset. So I think with more research, people's mindsets have changed as well. Um, so when I played in college, I had my strength coach or head strength coach was a former like West Side barbell, like powerlifting, had a very powerlifting way of doing things, which was great. And now you see like it's kind of shifted now to, you know, college staffs having a little bit of everything of we're going to focus on speed development. We might throw some powerlifting stuff in there as well. A lot on the recovery side as well. That's changed over time. So, and I think it just shows how young our profession is. So I think like the first full time strength and conditioning coach was employed in like the 80s at some point. So it's still a really young profession, and through that you see a lot of growth and a lot of change.
Nice, nice. So the first thing I want to ask is about like uh for you guys to train speed. Before you train speed, how do you like activate the core for like let's say like linear speed?
Mhm. Yeah. So I would say before we get into that, this kind of defined core. So, and it might just be semantics, but I think it makes a lot more sense later on when we start talking about things like trunk discipline. So that's that's a big thing for us. So if I'm talking about the core, referring to the core, we're really going to be referring to anything between the shoulders and the hips, right? So um, that's part of part of my job as an educator is to help coaches and athletes sometimes, but mostly coaches, understand the principles behind our speed and speed development. So when we talk about trunk discipline, for example, it's always good to know, what we're talking about. But again, talking about principles, we first kind of, just like anything, we just want to kind of work backwards. So we're talking about linear speed, and we can even break it down into acceleration. What are some of the things or some of the principles that need to remain constant for effective acceleration? Um, and one of those things is going to be, again, what we call trunk discipline. So, something that we may look at is how the pelvis works and how athletes extend their hips or enter hip extension. So you probably heard Jonas talk about it a lot, butt before back or bum before back. And it's really just a simple way of, referring to this lumbo-pelvic dissociation of I have an athlete, we need to get into hip extension to be able to accelerate. But can we do that, or can my athlete do that without going into lower back extension or lumbar extension? Right. So, knowing that a lot of our core work or our trunk work before we get into sprinting is going to address that. And more than likely, we're going to be addressing the pelvis and how the pelvis moves and when the pelvis comes into play and whatnot. So, I think a lot of the things is a lot of the times uh, when we talk about like our trunk work or even like our strength work with regard to speed development, it may not look like it has anything to do with speed, right? So sometimes it will, but for me, especially if I'm working with an athlete for the first time, or maybe younger athletes, our trunk activation or trunk work before we get into our speed or acceleration might be a simple glute bridge of us just getting on the ground, and we're going to make sure that we can get into extension. So extension is our hip extension is our end goal. But again, how do we do that? And even some of my older athletes have trouble with that when we really break it down into like going segment by segment, piece by piece. Of first, um, first making sure the pelvis is in the right position before we get into our bridge, and then going, like I said, piece by piece of uh, lumbar spine, thoracic spine, uh, just segment for segment till we get to our position. And a lot of times you'll see, like even like I said, even some of your more experienced athletes might have trouble getting into that position, or after a few seconds, if we're working on an isometric, you might see them shaking pretty pretty heavily because it's a new feeling, right? So um, that's probably one of my go-tos, and that's why I always preach to coaches, understand the principles first. So coming back to the principle of butt before back, or butt before back being a key performance indicator for effective acceleration. If you understand that that is something that we need to be able to do and something that we need to be good at to accelerate well, then you'll be able to find your own methods. So understand the principles, which are few, and then you can really get creative with your own methods. There's a million different methods, right? So you know yourself, there's so many different variations to a glute bridge. But as long as I understand the principle and why we're doing an exercise and understand the intent behind doing the exercise, then you'll be able to select your own method, whether we progress to a single leg glute bridge, whether it's isometric, whether we really focus on the eccentric section or the concentric section. We can then add resistance. One thing we also do is also a variation of a glute bridge. We call it like a tabletop. Same thing. Can we get into hip extension without extending through our lower back? So this might be a good time for me to share my screen here.
Cool.
Got some things here prepped. Good. So can you see my screen?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Okay, perfect. So Um, I'm not sure if I have the glute bridge, but this would be a variation of our glute bridge. We call it a tabletop, right? So again, working on maintaining that extension piece. So we could regress this and do it bilateral, so keep it double legged and just work on holding the position as an isometric. We can then work through the whole range of motion, or we do it like we just did here, like you see in the video of a marching tabletop, which is then gonna be a little bit more difficult. As you can see, got some notes written down here as well for this particular video. But as we're switching from left to right, focusing on not letting the hips sink, which is going to be for a lot of athletes the natural instinct, right? So again, maintaining proper hip extension without getting into lumbar extension, right? So again, that butt before back being the principle, and then we can find our exercises to then support that principle. One thing we also use a lot of is here another variation of a glute bridge. So going from a glute bridge into a front plank, and this is one of my favorite exercises, especially if I'm working with an athlete for the first time, because I can just say our goal is to go from a glute bridge into a front plank, and the rules of the game are your hips can't touch the ground. And then you start seeing athletes find all kinds of ways to get into that front plank, right? But eventually, there's really only one way to do it. But it's fun seeing how athletes try to problem solve, um, to get into that position. But again, the principle stays the same. Even when we get back to our glute bridge, are you still able to extend through your hips without extending through your lower back? Um, and
Nice,
this
nice.
is another one that we use. This is a side plank to a dead bug. So again, a little bit more dynamic. So rolling into the dead bug forces you to find tension extremely quickly. And again, I would just tell the athlete here to find tension before you land on your back. And again, this is going to be I could really use this exercise for acceleration or for our upright running, our max velocity, or even for some of our transitional movements or our change of direction and game speed stuff. Yeah. So again, I think I'm going to come back here. I think the biggest thing is really just understanding the principles. Same thing if we're looking at upright running, max velocity. We do want to be able to maintain a relatively upright posture. But again, the question is, how do we do that? Do we have to extend through our lower back to be able to do that? Is my head and my spine completely out of place? All right, so that's when we talk about trunk discipline. Again, those are the principles that we need to be able to maintain and that need to remain consistent. And from there, I can find my own. I can really find my own methods or be creative with my own methods.
Cool. So, uh, like you mentioned, those are more like for acceleration and like max velocity. So, what's the difference between prepping the core for linear speed and prepping the core for like multi-directional movement?
Mhm. Yeah. So again, we'll come back to principles. So if I'm gonna prep the core, if we're doing some of our trunk work for our change of direction or multi-directional movement, there's some key performance indicators again there, just like butt before back. Um, there's some things, and I think maybe Hailu has also maybe you've heard Hailu say it. Do you sit or do you fold? So if I'm working a lateral shuffle in one direction and I need to put my foot in the ground, make a plant step, and then go in the opposite direction, when I make that cut or when I make that change of direction, am I able to sit into that cut or do I fold at my trunk? All right, so same thing. If I go from the left and I need to go back to the right, I need to be able to have the trunk control and the trunk discipline to now shift into the direction in which I want to go. Because, if we look at like ACL injuries, if I'm not able to, if I'm going to the left and all my momentum is taking me to the left, and I'm not able to keep my trunk from flexing also towards the left, then I have a big problem, right? So now I'm just putting too much stress. There's too much torque and like shear torque on that plant leg. So again, principles or key performance indicators of change of direction and multi-directional movement is, do you sit or do you fold? So being able to control the trunk. Sorry, I'm gonna share my screen here again. So being able to control the trunk in really all planes of movement um, would be one thing that we want to look at here. So if I get back to, let's see. Okay, so here would be an exercise. It's actually from this morning. But again, working on sitting or folding. So I've got, it's really essentially just a farmer's walk, a single unilateral farmer's walk. But again, trying to maintain my trunk position while I've got a force trying to pull me into the opposite direction, pull me into that flexion. So here again, if I was to be cutting on my right foot or my right leg here, I would need to have the control of my trunk to be able to shift back towards the left side, for first and foremost for just for safety issues of avoiding putting my knee in a bad position, but also for effective deceleration, right? So um, if I'm decelerating and need to go back to the left, I need to be able to reorientate my body in the right position. So, and a lot of that comes down to controlling the trunk. So again, very simple exercise, but the thing that makes it applicable is our intent and the reason why we do that. Same thing here. So again, being able to control my trunk and switch my trunk from going one direction to the other. Again, coming back to that principle of, am I able to sit into my plant step or do I end up folding into my plant step? Um, when we get back and we get into like some of our transitional movements, we start talking about rotation. And, one thing that you realize more and more through research is, older athletes or more experienced athletes really have a hard time kind of, I wouldn't say a hard time, but for whatever reason, when it comes to rotating their head with their body, right? Um, that's something that we kind of lose as we get older. For whatever reason, one of my theories is, as we get more experienced as athletes, if I look at myself, having played football for 23 years, by the time I got to, like year 20, I knew the situation, so I didn't have to be as aware of my surroundings on the field. I knew what would be coming. If I needed to scan for something or whatnot, I usually knew when it was time to look. But a lot of times if I'm working with athletes on transitional movements, I'm teaching them just how to rotate again. So here, very simple movement, really just working on rotating the head with the trunk and also being able to separate at the thoracic spine as well. So we could also do fast forward here, a cable lift, same thing, being able to separate at the thoracic spine, but also being able to rotate with my head and my body at the same time. So I'm gonna come back to you here.
Nice.
So again, biggest thing is always just principles and intent of knowing why we're doing an exercise or a drill and how it fits into, how it applies to our key performance indicators for whatever it is that we're working on or whatever it is that our focus is.
Nice. So, since we're talking about multi-directional movement, the next thing I want to ask is about, I saw on your Instagram you discuss a lot about like agility and like change of direction. So, what exactly is the difference between change of direction and agility?
Mm-hmm. No, good question. I think sometimes that it kind of gets interchanged. Like people, we see it used interchangeably a lot, especially on social media, and it's not just semantics, but if I were to explain it very simply, and I try to keep things simple for myself, for the first and foremost, but also for coaches, if we're working on education, but to simply put or explain the difference between change of direction and agility, change of direction would be the set of skills that I have to be able to change either the direction, my direction. We can also look at changing velocities. So going from a jog to a sprint in soccer, for example, changing my mode of movement. So going from a back pedal and then rotating or using a drop step to transition into a sprint, or going from a crossover to a sprint or a back pedal, whatever it is. So change of direction would be the set of skills and also the physical, physical qualities and capabilities to be able to do those things. While agility would be change of direction with the reaction to a stimulus. All right, so essentially working from closed, so very closed to very open. And one analogy that I like is, the difference between a counter movement jump and a drop jump, because a drop or counter movement jump, excuse me, is very predictable for me. I know if I'm doing a counter movement jump, I know when I need to get my arms involved. I know how I need to load, when I need to navigate the ground, how much time I have to navigate the ground, and whatnot. And that would be our change of direction. Whereas a drop jump, although I might know how high the box is from which I'm jumping, um, now it's very sudden. I need to now react to that initial drop. I don't know exactly when I'm going to have to navigate the ground, when I'm going to be able to need to swing my arms. And the thing is, they aren't exactly or aren't necessarily separate from each other. Because if I enhance or if I get better at a counter movement jump, then theoretically I should get better at a drop jump. So again, one being the set of skills and the tools and the physical capabilities, and the other one now being using those tools and those capabilities uh, as a reaction to a stimulus, and in a very open environment. It could be also be we can call it a chaotic environment, because that's really what sport is at the end of the day. But that would be my very simple but a little bit long and drawn out explanation of change of direction and agility.
Yeah, I love that. I love the analogy for like counter movement jump and drop jump.
Mm-hmm.
Since you're an athlete before and now you're like performance coach and performance consultant, um, we all know that the elite athlete are different with others because their reaction time are like faster. So are this kind of ability are is it trainable? And like how is the process gonna be like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think reaction time is definitely trainable. But that's also me being I'm a very repetition based person. So I like to believe that reaction time is trainable. Um, Training for it is, again, it can look, I mean, it can look or have a lot of different looks. And I've seen a lot of it done. Unfortunately, I'm never really in a position where I can just isolate reaction time. Um, I've seen people use, like, you've probably seen like the lights, for example. I don't want to throw a product name in there, but Blaze Pods is probably the most prevalent one. But using lights, in a sport like American football, for example, reaction time is a huge thing. So again, using different apps on phones and whatnot, and different stimuluses. Yeah, but like I said, I've never really been in a situation where I have time um, to just isolate reaction time. But there are some theories out there with research of finding ways to separate players, especially when it comes to um, open environments and our change of direction capabilities. Of you might have an athlete that is a very fast mover, so they can move laterally very quickly, but they are a slow thinker, and not in the sense of not being very smart, but just having a slower reaction time. Whereas you may have another athlete that is a fast thinker and a slow mover, which I think it's really interesting research. Um, the only thing is it's really tough to kind of essentially get into somebody's head. I think though with what I've seen or what we've seen in the last years, it's probably not too far off before we're able to do that. But it is a very interesting theory and a very interesting research that I'm definitely looking forward to getting a little bit deeper into.
Nice, nice. So the next topic I want to discuss is about like it's also on you post a lot of like topic of this. It's what exactly is like game speed, like you mentioned on the beginning of our conversation, and how is it different with like just training pure sprinting?
Yeah, so game speed is really going to come down to, again, keeping it simple, the manipulation of space, right? So if we're looking at soccer, for example, on the offensive side of the ball, can I create space? Can I get away from a defender? On the defensive side of the ball, can I close space? Can I keep up with the offense? Right. So essentially, you could really ask those questions as performance indicators for athletes: is are you fast enough to keep up with the person that you're supposed to be defending? Or are you fast enough or agile enough to get away from the person that's defending you, right? But when you start looking at game speed, it really comes down to the manipulation of space, of creating space or closing space. All right. So the difference between game speed and sprint training, again, and that's one of these situations where one contributes to the other. So part of our game speed model is being able to accelerate, right? So, if we look at just being able to change direction, for example, one of the things that could enhance my change of direction capabilities is better or more effective acceleration. So going into a cut with a higher entry velocity or making my cut and being able to more effectively accelerate out of that cut, right? So they do go kind of hand in hand. But now when if we're training for acceleration or if we're training for upright running or max velocity, it's going to be usually a relatively closed closed environment. And I say closed because, you know, my athletes know that we're sprinting. They know that we're going to be sprinting for 10 meters or for 20 meters or for 40 meters, or that we're doing a flying 20 or a flying 10 with a 15-meter buildup, right? So my athletes know that there's really only one thing to do, and it's sprint, right? Whereas now game speed is extremely open. So the closer we get to more game specific and sport specific scenarios, it's going to be extremely open of I might have to sprint to close space. I might have to crossover. I may have to backpedal. I might have to do a rotational or a drop step. And just in there, I've kind of named our four basic transitional movements of game speed of backpedal, lateral shuffle, crossover, and drop step or rotational step, right? But again, game speed is now really just um, moving more towards game specific, game like situations, very open. I may not know what I need to do to react to that stimulus. So if we're looking again, going back to change of direction and agility, or we can even call it change of direction and game speed, again, change of direction is going to be, do I have the physical capabilities to be able to shuffle laterally or to do a crossover step or a rotational step? So physical capabilities being, am I strong enough to get in and out of those cuts? Do I have the internal rotation, for example, to do a rotational step or a drop step, internal rotation of the hip, um, right? So we might also again focus on acceleration and just pure deceleration. So some of those capabilities and those physical qualities that we need, and we're basically moving across the spectrum of starting with our basic physical capabilities and qualities, now going towards our game speed. So the next step would be, working some of our transitional movements in a very close setting of I just want you to do a lateral shuffle back and forth between 5 meters. So you know, I'm starting on this line, I'm going to the next line, I'm coming back to my starting line. It's very closed drill, very closed environment. Nothing extremely reactive. I know I need to shuffle. I know I need to shuffle laterally. I know where I need to make my cut. I know where I need to go after I make my cut. To now we'll get into make it a little bit more reactive. So I'm going to show you if we need to shuffle left or shuffle right. So again, close reactive, you know that we need to shuffle or do a lateral shuffle, but you're going to react to my stimulus of me showing you in which direction we're shuffling, to now making it now more open of, you may need to shuffle. If I give you this signal, we need to do a drop step, right? And then now throwing in more of a stimulus. So, I might have add a player with a ball and you need to, again, close the space. And how you close that space, whether it's a crossover step, whether it's a back pedal, doesn't matter. But the player can now also change directions. So you don't know when that's coming. So again, we've essentially gone from our change of direction, very, very basic change of direction capabilities, to now, throwing in that stimulus and also some of our transitional movements.
Cool. So the next thing I want to ask, I'm gonna jump out the list I sent you, and since we're talking about like change of direction, agility, or like game speed, uh, deceleration, because it's gonna be a huge part of these kind of like movement. So how exactly do you guys like introduce like deceleration into the training process, and from the beginning to the end? How exactly is, or how would you like train the deceleration?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, coming back to the whole thing of understanding principles, if we understand the principles of acceleration, then we've essentially understood the principles of deceleration. Now we just work backwards, right? So if for acceleration, I need to, orientation plays a huge part. So if I want to be able to accelerate effectively, I need to be able to orientate my body horizontally in the direction in which I want to go. Same thing, if I want to decelerate now, if I'm moving in this direction, if I want to decelerate, I essentially have to turn my body or orientate my body horizontally in the other direction, right? So, um, that's one of the good things, again, about understanding principles and being able to define your own methods. But again, we just look at the things so again, working backwards, if we look at what makes deceleration difficult, then we can kind of figure out how we want to progress and regress those things. So, one of the biggest things that we can manipulate to introduce deceleration would be entry velocity or distance, right? So if I'm starting with a younger athlete or a less experienced athlete, or even if it's in a rehab setting, um, I'll make sure that the distances are very short. So we might keep it at 5 meters, and again, really focus on quality reps of, can you get into the positions that we need to get into to be able to decelerate effectively? Also, taking a step back, do you have the strength capabilities and some of those basic underlying physical capabilities of deceleration? But we'll assume that we do. And again, so introducing positions, we might start with some isometrics, again, against the wall, for example. And again, teaching those principles of sitting into a cut instead of folding into a cut. How do I manipulate my trunk during deceleration? And then again, like I said, we'll keep it very short. Keep so shorter distances. Obviously, don't allow for fast or very fast entry velocities. And as we get more proficient and get better at those movements, now I can increase the distances. We can also look at the angle of cut, for example, or angle of deceleration. So a 180-degree cut is going to be extremely taxing, right? So I need to essentially completely stop my momentum going in one direction and reaccelerate in the other. So that cut angle is going to be a little bit more difficult as opposed to, running in one direction and then decelerating, but keeping my momentum going in a diagonal or a 45-degree angle, right? So Um, that those would also be things that we look at and we're looking at progressing or regressing deceleration. But again, the biggest thing is going to be just understanding the principles, basic qualities, um, positions, so body positions, being able to get in those positions, being able to maintain those positions dynamically. Um, and then also, I'm sure Hailu talked to you about, just the role of this penultimate step as well. So that would be one thing that we also introduce, and one thing we also focus on when we're introducing or reintroducing deceleration. So again, and that's one reason why I always preach it. Understand the principles. We can come up with our own methods, really.
Nice, nice. Love that. So last thing before I let you go, okay? You talk more than once about like uh sitting in the position besides like
Mhm.
falling into the position position. So what's the difference between sitting in the position or falling into the position?
Mhm. Yeah, so sitting into the position. So again, if we're looking at using the example of a lateral shuffle, making a cut and then shuffling laterally in the opposite direction, so going from left to right, for example, falling in the position is going to be um, a lot harder to control, right? So um, just from a physics perspective, if my upper body is still falling in one direction, it's going to be really tough for me to get out of that, right? So that's going to be one thing. But one thing we also focus on is the mentality or the intent of the cut. So just like if I was going to be working with an athlete on a, again, coming back to a counter movement jump, right? What's one of the easiest things we can do to jump higher? We can use our arms, right? So we can teach arm swing, right? Same thing with sprinting. If we want to be able to effectively sprint, we need to be more aggressive with our switching. So that's also partially an intent thing or a mentality thing. Same thing with sitting or falling, intently sitting into the cut, intently putting ourselves in that better position to be able to break and to get out, and also looking further down the line of it's not going to just stop with me stopping my momentum in one direction. I still need to be able to get back to the other direction. So if we're talking about sprinting, turning and sprinting out of a cut, if my body's still falling all over the place or falling in the opposite direction, it's going to be really tough for me to do that. And then again, coming back to, you know, it's really, injury prevention or injury reduction. I really don't care how you want to word it, but you know, if my body is still falling into the cut or into that momentum, right? And now I'm trying to cut on my left leg. So you can imagine me shuffling to my left, trying to plant on my left foot, and my upper body is still falling towards the left or still traveling towards the left side. All right, that's probably one of the easiest recipes for an ACL, at least an ACL tear. So again, now it's just really just putting my body in the best position, in the best position to be effective with the movement. And you know, one of the biggest phrases we say or we have in American sports, at least in physical development, is the best ability is availability, right? So having players be able to be on the pitch or be in practice and whatnot. So again, always coming back to those principles and using those principles not only for effective deceleration and change of direction, but just keeping my athletes healthy, right?
Nice, nice. Love this. Love your approach. So
Thank you.
for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, and uh I love the way you like uh um mention like the I forgot the word, but you kind of like basic brought thing into like the basic so people can understand. I love this. I love this.
Mhm. Yeah, that's one of my favorite quotes. Just to summarize, is uh, Emerson, well, Ralph Waldo Emerson. We can we can, the principles are very few and methods are a million. So whoever understands principles can select their own methods. And I might have butchered the hell out of that, but I think you get the idea of understand the principles, understand the basics, and from there, use your intuition, your coach's eye to then really select your own methods. So,
I love that. I love that. Love that. So, for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
yeah. So my private Instagram is coach underscore chappy 10. Or just the Speedworks Instagram, which is, I believe, speedworks.training, or also speedworks.training homepage as well. So there you can see a lot of not just from me, but also from Jonas and from Hailu and all the great minds there at Alan Murdoch. You know, you really take the opportunity to learn a lot. So.
Nice, nice, nice.